The truck needed an oil change. That's the only reason I came back early. I had planned to spend the full weekend up at my brother-in-law's cabin in Gatlinburg, 3 days of fishing, bad coffee, and the kind of quiet that a 64-year-old man earns after 4 decades of working. But on Saturday morning, I was loading my gear into the bed of my F-150 when I noticed the oil light had been flickering on the drive up. Frank didn't have anything to drain it with, and I wasn't about to push my luck on a 2-hour mountain road. So I packed up Saturday evening instead of Sunday, kissed the peace and quiet goodbye, and pointed the truck south toward home. I pulled into my driveway just after 9 on Saturday night. There was a car parked along the side of my house, a silver Audi, backed in close to the fence line like whoever parked it was trying to keep it out of sight from the street. I didn't recognize it. I sat in my truck for a moment with the engine running, looking at it. My son Daniel's Jeep wasn't in the driveway. I knew he was traveling for work that weekend, a conference up in Chicago. He'd asked me 2 weeks ago if I could be available in case my daughter-in-law Rachel needed anything with the grandkids. I had said yes, without hesitating. I always said yes. My house sits on 2 acres, at the edge of a quiet neighborhood. Behind the main house, about 40 yards back, there's a workshop, a big detached garage I built 14 years ago with help from my brother and 2 good neighbors. Patricia picked out the wood stain. She drove to 4 different hardware stores because she didn't want just any shade of red. She wanted the color of a barn in a painting she'd seen somewhere, warm and deep. She found it. She was like that. She never settled for something that was almost right when the right thing existed somewhere and just needed looking for. After she passed 3 years ago, I spent most of my evenings in that workshop, not building anything for a long while, just sitting with her coffee mug on the workbench beside me, listening to the radio she used to complain was too loud. It was the place I felt closest to her, the one corner of the world that still smelled like sawdust and her hand lotion and the lavender candles she burned to cover the wood stain fumes. The light in my workshop was on. I could see the yellow glow through the small window that faces the house. I stood in my driveway for a moment after killing the engine, telling myself it was probably Daniel. Maybe his flight got canceled. Maybe the conference ended early. Maybe he stopped by to check on things. But Daniel's Jeep wasn't there, and the Audi wasn't Daniel's. I walked around the side of the house slowly. The grass was still wet from an afternoon rain, and I remember the sound of it under my boots, that soft press and pull of damp ground. The night was warm, the kind of Tennessee September evening that holds the heat from the day long after dark. I stopped when I reached the corner of the house, where I could see the workshop clearly. The door was cracked open. I could hear music. Something low and indistinct, not the classic country station I kept programmed into the old radio on my shelf. This was different, smoother, the kind of music that plays in restaurants where the portions are small and the prices aren't written on the menu. I recognized my daughter-in-law's laugh. I stood there with my hand on the corner of the house, and I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not surprise, exactly. Something worse than surprise. Something that felt like watching a piece of furniture tip over in slow motion, that helpless moment between when you know it's going to fall and when it actually hits the floor. I thought about walking back to my truck. I thought about it seriously. I told myself I was wrong. I told myself Rachel had a reasonable explanation. She was close with her sister. Maybe they were having a girls' night and borrowed the space. Maybe one of her friends had car trouble. Maybe 100 things. I walked to the workshop door and pushed it open. Rachel was sitting on the old wooden stool I kept near the workbench, and there was a man standing beside her, close enough that their arms were touching. He was tall, maybe mid-40s, wearing a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. There was an open bottle of wine on my workbench. 2 glasses. The radio I kept tuned to 650 AM was playing something I didn't recognize. They both turned when the door swung open. Rachel's face went through about 4 different expressions in the space of 2 seconds. The last one was something I can only describe as cold calculation, the look of a person deciding quickly how to manage a situation. The man took a step back. He said something low that I didn't catch. "Walter," Rachel said. Her voice was almost completely steady. "I thought you were gone until Sunday." "I was," I said. I looked at the man. He was looking at the floor, then at the door, then at me. in a cycle that told me everything I needed to know about his character. "Who are you?" I asked him. He told me his name was Marcus. He said it like he was hoping I'd receive it and move on. "Marcus," I said, "I think you should leave." Rachel started to say something. I raised one hand, just slightly, and she stopped. I don't know why she stopped. Maybe it was the tone. Maybe it was the fact that I wasn't raising my voice. My father taught me something when I was young that I never forgot. He said the quieter you get, the louder the other person hears you. I was very quiet. Marcus picked up a light jacket from the edge of the workbench and walked past me without making eye contact. I heard his footsteps cross the gravel, heard the Audi's door open and close, heard the engine turn over. I stood in the doorway of my workshop and watched his taillights until they reached the end of my long driveway and turned out onto the road. Then I turned back to Rachel. She was standing now. She had picked up her wine glass and was holding it with both hands, and her chin was up in the way I had seen before when she and Daniel argued, when she was challenged about something. Defensive. "Ready. I know what you're thinking," she said. "I'm not thinking anything yet," I said. "I'm still looking at my wife's workshop with another man's jacket on her workbench." Rachel set the glass down. "Marcus is a colleague. We were just talking." I looked at the two wine glasses. I looked at the music playing from my radio that she had retuned without asking. I looked at the stool she had been sitting on, Patricia's stool, the one she always dragged over when she'd come to watch me work, pulled close to where Marcus had been standing. "Rachel," I said, "don't." She was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in her face, and for a second I thought she was going to cry, and I thought maybe that would make this easier, the crying, the confession, the beginning of some honest conversation, but she didn't cry. What I saw in her expression was harder than that. It was resentment. "You shouldn't have come back early," she said. "No," I said. "I suppose I shouldn't have." I asked her to go home. I told her I needed some time in my workshop alone. She looked at me like she wanted to say something else, and then seemed to decide against it. She took her purse from the corner near the door. I hadn't even noticed it there, and she left. I watched her silver car from the window until it was gone. Then I sat down on Patricia's stool, and I put my hands flat on the workbench, and I looked at the two wine glasses she had left behind, and I allowed myself to feel everything that was trying to push through all at once. Daniel had married Rachel 9 years ago. I was there when he proposed a backyard dinner that he spent 3 days preparing, because he was that kind of man, careful and thoughtful and willing to put in the work. Patricia cried when Rachel said yes. She pulled me close in the kitchen afterward and said, "She's going to be good for him, Walter. I can feel it." I had trusted Patricia's instincts about people for 38 years. She was almost never wrong. I sat in that workshop for a long time. I thought about my grandchildren, Emma, who was 8 and already reading books 2 grades above her level, and Noah, who was 5 and who called me Pop Pop, and who always wanted to know how every tool in my workshop worked. I thought about what their lives were going to look like in 6 months, or a year, or 10 years, depending on what happened next. I thought about Daniel, about the trip to Chicago, about how he would call Rachel that night before bed, the way he always did when he traveled, and she would tell him everything was fine. I didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table for a long time before I picked up my phone. I wasn't calling Daniel, not yet. I needed to know more before I handed my son a grenade without understanding what I was dealing with. What I mean is, if this was one moment of bad judgment, a single evening that had gone somewhere it shouldn't have, that was one thing. If this was something else, something with deeper roots, Daniel deserved to know the full shape of it, not just the piece I'd stumbled into. I had a friend named Gerald. We'd worked together for 20 years at the same engineering firm. Gerald had gone into private investigation after he retired, not the kind you see in movies, mostly insurance fraud and background checks. But he was thorough and he was discreet, and he owed me more than a few favors from over the years. I texted him first, told him I needed to talk. He called me back within the hour. I gave him Marcus's first name and the description of the Audi. Gerald told me he'd have something in a few days. I told him to take whatever time he needed. Rachel called me Sunday afternoon. I let it ring. She called again in the evening. I didn't answer that time either. I needed to be calm when I spoke with her, and I was not yet calm. Gerald called me on Wednesday. Marcus Webb, 46 years old, regional sales director for a medical supply company headquartered in Nashville. He and Rachel had worked on a joint project 2 years ago. His company and her firm had partnered on a contract. They had stayed in contact after the partnership wrapped up. He was married. His wife's name was Sandra. They had a daughter, 9 years old, and a son who was 7. Gerald sent me 2 photographs. I won't describe them in detail. I'll just say that what was in those photographs was not 2 colleagues having a glass of wine and talking. I put my phone face down on the kitchen table and looked out the window at the backyard for a long time. The big oak Patricia and I had planted the year we moved in was turning early, the tips of the leaves going amber at the edges. She always said that tree was the best thing we'd ever done to this property. Better than the kitchen remodel, better than the back deck. Just that one tree, planted in the right place, growing for 30 years. I thought about Sandra Webb. I thought about a woman who had 2 children and a husband who drove a silver Audi to another man's property and left his jacket on a dead woman's workbench. I thought about what it would mean for Sandra to not know. Daniel came home from Chicago on Thursday evening. I drove over to their house Friday morning under the pretense of fixing the screen door he'd asked me to look at weeks ago. I brought my tools. Rachel was home. She worked remotely on Fridays. She met me at the door, and her expression was unreadable. Daniel was in the back, putting the kids through a reading lesson he did with them every weekend morning, something that had started as a quarantine habit and never stopped. I could hear Noah complaining about the letter Q from the hallway. I replaced the screen. I drank the coffee Daniel brought me. I watched Rachel move around the kitchen with the careful neutrality of a person who has rehearsed their normal. She didn't look at me directly when she refilled the coffee pot. I didn't look at her directly either. Daniel walked me out to my truck when I was leaving. "You're quiet today," he said. He was 38 years old, and he still looked like the boy who used to fall asleep in the workshop watching me sand cabinet doors. Tired around the eyes lately, he'd been working too hard. I knew that. He was the kind of man who took on more than his share without being asked, which meant people kept giving him more. "Just tired," I said. "Old man stuff." He laughed. He clapped me on the shoulder and told me he'd call me that weekend. I drove home and sat with what I knew for the rest of the day. I want to be clear about something. I have never been the kind of father who tried to run his son's life. Patricia and I made a decision early we would raise Daniel to be his own man, and when he was grown, we would trust him to handle his own life. We gave opinions when asked. We bit our tongues when not asked. I had held that line for 38 years. But Daniel wasn't just a grown man making his own choices. He was a man being deceived. There is a difference. A man who chooses something with full information is exercising his freedom. A man who is being lied to isn't choosing anything. He's just moving through a false version of his own life, making decisions based on facts that aren't real. My son deserved real facts. And there was something else. Something I kept coming back to every time I tried to think clearly about this. Sandra Webb deserved real facts, too. I found her through Gerald. He sent me her work email. She was a nurse practitioner at a practice in Brentwood. He also found her personal phone number. I held both pieces of information for 2 days without using them. On Sunday evening, I sat in the workshop with the lights low and the radio off, and I thought about Patricia. I thought about whether she would have done what I was thinking about doing. Patricia was not a soft woman. She had a tenderness that ran deep, but she had a spine of iron underneath it, and she had a very clear sense of what was right. She didn't believe in comfortable lies. She didn't believe that protecting people from hard truths was the same as protecting them. She used to say that kindness sometimes wore the mask of silence, but silence wasn't always kind. I picked up my phone and I called Sandra Webb. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was warm and slightly cautious, the way anyone sounds when an unfamiliar number calls on a Sunday evening. I told her my name. I told her who my son was. I told her what I had seen in my workshop 8 days earlier, and I told her that I had documentation she was welcome to review if she chose to. I told her I was sorry to be the one making this call. I told her she deserved to know. She was very quiet for a long time. Then she asked me just one question. She asked if I was certain. I told her I was. She thanked me. Her voice didn't break, but I could hear the weight of what I'd just placed on her, the way a floor sounds different when something heavy is set down on it. We spoke for less than 4 minutes. When she hung up, I sat for a while in the dark of my workshop and felt the strange, heavy stillness of having done something that couldn't be undone. The following Tuesday, I called Daniel and asked him to meet me for breakfast. Just the two of us. He could hear something in my voice. He'd always been perceptive that way, even as a child, and he didn't ask questions, just said he'd be there. We met at the diner on Franklin Pike that we'd been going to since he was a teenager. We ordered the same things we always ordered. When the food came, I set my fork down, and I looked at my son, and I told him everything. I told him about coming home early, about the workshop, about Marcus Webb, about Gerald and the photographs, about Sandra. I watched him go very still. Daniel was not a man who showed a lot of emotion in public. He had that from me, I think, that tendency to pull inward when something was hitting hard. He looked at the table. He looked at his coffee cup. His jaw worked once. He didn't say anything for almost 2 full minutes. Then he said, very quietly, "How long have you known?" "Since the night I came home," I said. "I wanted to have everything before I came to you. I didn't want to hand you half a picture." He nodded slowly, like he was taking inventory of something internal. "The photos," he said. "Gerald still has them?" He sent them to a secure folder. "Whatever you need." He picked up his fork and looked at his eggs and put it back down without eating. "She was in Mom's workshop," he said. Not a question. He already knew. I had told him. But sometimes people need to say a thing out loud to make it real. "Yes," I said. He pressed his hand flat against the table, the same gesture I had made that first night. I noticed that, and it hit me somewhere in the sternum. We sat there together for a long time. I paid the check. He didn't argue about it the way he usually did. We walked out into the pale October morning, and he stood at his Jeep with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at nothing in particular. "I have to think," he said. "You have time," I said. "Take what you need." He looked at me then. His eyes were red at the edges. "Why did you call her? The wife. Why not just why her first?" I thought about how to answer that. I had thought about it for days, and I still wasn't sure I had the perfect explanation. What I told him was this: that Sandra Webb had 2 children who needed their mother to have real information about her own life. That Sandra was living inside the same lie that he had been living inside, and she hadn't done anything to deserve it any more than he had. That sometimes the right thing to do wasn't the easy thing, and wasn't the thing that felt satisfying in the moment, but was the thing that took the widest view of who was actually getting hurt. Daniel listened. He nodded once. "Mom would have done the same thing," he said. "I know," I said. He hugged me before he got in the Jeep. A long, tight hug, the kind he hadn't given me since Patricia's funeral. I stood in the parking lot of that diner and watched him drive away, and felt the particular exhaustion of a man who has done the right thing and knows it doesn't make anything easier. The next several weeks were difficult. I won't dress them up. Daniel retained an attorney. Rachel retained one of her own. There were conversations that took place that I was not part of and don't know the full content of, because they were between a husband and his wife, and I had made my contribution and stepped back. That was where I belonged. What I know is this: Rachel did not deny it. After a certain point, the photographs were what they were. Marcus Webb, from what I understood, had already been confronted by Sandra. I don't know the details of their situation, and I didn't try to find out. That wasn't my story to follow. Daniel moved into a short-term rental in early November. He took the kids on alternating weeks, which wasn't easy for any of them. Emma was old enough to understand that something had broken, and not old enough to understand why. Noah kept asking when Daddy was coming back to sleep at the house, and I didn't always have a good answer when he asked me. I picked them up from school on Thursdays when Daniel was busy, and sometimes I brought them to the workshop. I taught Emma how to sand a piece of wood with the grain. I let Noah sort hardware into the little labeled jars on the shelf, which was not technically useful but which he took extremely seriously. I let them eat their after-school snacks, sitting on the workbench, their feet swinging, asking me questions about every tool in the place. One afternoon, Noah picked up the old coffee mug I kept on the shelf. Patricia's mug, the one with the bluebird on it, the one I'd never been able to put away, and looked at it very carefully. "Pop, pop," he said. "Whose is this?" "That belonged to your grandma," I said. He held it with both hands, the way small children hold fragile things, serious and steady. "Does it make you sad?" he asked. I thought about it. "Sometimes," I said. "But mostly it makes me remember good things." He nodded like that made complete sense and handed it carefully back to me and went back to sorting the hardware. I set the mug back on the shelf and looked at it for a moment. Then I looked at Emma, who was focused on her sanding with the precision of someone who had been told there was a right way to do it and intended to find it. Then at Noah, counting screws with his lips moving. This, I thought, is still here. Whatever has broken, whatever is hard right now, these two are still here, and they are fine, and they will be fine. The court process moved slowly, the way those things always do. Daniel's attorney was thorough. The financial piece was the part I hadn't fully seen coming, but which became significant. Rachel had made several large transfers from their joint savings over the 14 months preceding that September evening. Daniel had noticed discrepancies, but had trusted her explanations. He hadn't pushed. He was that kind of husband, trusting, not inclined to question, not suspicious by nature. That trust had cost him. The judge ordered a forensic accounting review. What came back was substantial, not ruinous, but significant. The transfers had gone toward things that weren't hard to trace, once someone was looking expenses that had nothing to do with their household, their children, or their shared life. I won't say I felt satisfaction. That's not quite right. What I felt was something older and quieter than satisfaction, the feeling of watching something that was already broken get recognized as broken. The difference between a lie and the truth isn't just moral, it's structural. A lie is a building with a bad foundation. It will stand for a while, sometimes for years, but it is always going to come down. In December, Daniel came over on a Sunday, and we built a set of wooden toy shelves for the kids' rooms at his rental apartment. We worked for most of the day without talking much. That was something we had always been able to do, share a space without filling it up with words. Patricia used to say she had a husband and a son who could communicate in silence better than most people did in full sentences. She meant it as a compliment, I think, though she said it with that particular look she had. At some point in the afternoon, Daniel set down his sanding block and looked around the workshop. "I want to tell you something," he said. I kept my hands busy. "What you did calling Sandra Webb before you called me, I didn't understand it at first. Honestly, I was a little angry about it. That you'd told someone else before you told me." "I know," I said. "But I've been thinking about it," he said. About her kids. About what she would have been dealing with if she hadn't known. About the fact that her husband would have gone home to her that night and every night after, and she'd have been living inside something she didn't know. He was quiet for a moment. "She didn't deserve that." "No," I said. "She didn't." "Neither did I," he said. "But at least I had you to tell me." He picked the sanding block back up. She didn't have anyone. We worked until the light outside the workshop windows went thin and blue with early winter dark. He stayed for dinner. We ordered pizza, because neither of us had remembered to plan anything better, and we ate it at the kitchen table the way we used to when he was young, and Patricia was late getting home from one of her evening walks, and it was just the two of us making do. He talked about the kids, about how Emma had started writing short stories at school, and how her teacher had called to say she had real talent, which I already knew from the stories she read to me in the workshop while I worked. He talked about a new project at work, something he was genuinely excited about for the first time in a while. He talked about small things, ordinary things, the kind of conversation that means a person is finding their way back to their own life. I listened. I ate my pizza. I thought about Patricia. I thought about how she would have handled all of this. She would have cried at the right moments and been tough at the right moments, and she would have known instinctively the difference. She would have had the exact right thing to say to Daniel that I was never quite able to find. But she also would have trusted me to show up and do what needed doing, and to love our son the right way, even when I didn't have the words. That, I thought, I had done. After Daniel left, I walked out to the workshop and turned on the lights. I had been spending evenings out there again, building things now, instead of just sitting. A set of coat hooks for Emma's room. A small step stool for Noah. It was good to be using my hands again, to be making something. I stood at the workbench and looked at the space. The wine glasses were long gone. I had washed and put them away that same night, which was maybe a smaller gesture than it sounds. The radio was back on 650 AM. Patricia's coffee mug was on the shelf where it always was. I thought about what Rachel had said to me that night. You shouldn't have come back early. She had meant it as a complaint. As a grievance? As if the problem was my inconvenient timing. I had turned that sentence over in my head many times in the months since. But here's the thing. She was right. If I hadn't come back early, I wouldn't have known. If I hadn't known, Daniel would still be living inside a lie. Sandra Webb might still be living inside one too. The financial transfers would have continued. The children would have grown up in a household built on a false floor. Everything that was broken before I walked into that workshop. I didn't break it. I just saw it. Seeing it was enough. I picked up the coffee mug and held it for a moment the way I sometimes did at the end of a long evening. The ceramic was cool and smooth under my fingers, the bluebird on the side worn slightly from years of use, the handle still solid. I set it back on the shelf. I turned off the radio. I turned off the lights and walked back through the October dark to the house. Above the tree line, the sky was clear and full of stars. The oak in the backyard was bare now, all the amber leaves down, but the tree itself was solid and still, the way it had been for 30 years, the way it would be for 30 more. Sometimes that's what holding on looks like. Not dramatic, not loud, just still and present, and rooted deep enough that the seasons passing over you don't take you down. I went inside. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table where Patricia and I had sat for 38 years of mornings, and I thought about my son and my grandchildren, and what comes next. What comes next is the hard, ordinary, beautiful work of rebuilding. Daniel will do it. I know that the way I know the wood grain of every piece of furniture in this house, intimately, from the inside out. He is that kind of man, patient and thorough, and willing to put in the work. He will be all right. The kids will be all right. And in the workshop behind my house, the one Patricia chose the paint for, where she used to sit on the wooden stool and talk to me while I built things, the tools hang in their places on the pegboard, and the radio still plays classic country, and there is still a coffee mug on the shelf with a bluebird on it. She chose this place well. She almost always chose well.